Quick warning for some violence in this video. I'll be talking about the John Wick movies, and while I'll avoid the goriest scenes, there will be some guns and blood shown, so just be warned. It's really easy for movies to be realistic. In fact, you could argue that the default state of movies is realism. The camera captures what it sees, and for it to see something that's not part of our reality takes extra work. Writing scripts, building sets and props, editing the footage. It takes effort to move a film out of our reality. On the other hand, it's also really easy for movies to be unrealistic. The fire hose of money Hollywood throws at most blockbuster productions seems to almost demand an unbelievable level of everything. Scenes become steeped in CGI, characters become untouchably larger than life. The film is removed to a different plane of existence. It intersects with our reality only in the barest sense. The characters go to a coffee shop. The characters speak English. Characters have 5 fingers. Mickey Mouse couldn't even get that one right. We know these aren't people like us. We can relate to them, sure, but they live in an impossibly different world. An entirely separate reality. Where exactly we draw this line between reality and unreality varies with each film, but it's mostly informed by genre. In the paper Unrealistic Fictions, the authors argue that the genre of a film informs the audience's expectation of the similarity class. That is, how close the world of the film is to our own reality. Knowing The Lord of the Rings is fantasy, we don't expect Frodo to have a cell phone or a driver's license. We do, however, expect for the story to follow the laws of physics, for the characters to react genuinely to their situations, for every man to carry a sword and shield and 5 different belts. Knowing that Die Hard is an action movie, we can accept John McClane's proficiency with guns, his knowledge about explosives, his higher-than-average pain tolerance. Actually, for action movies, Die Hard feels remarkably realistic, closer to our reality than many films of the genre. The everyday guy persona of John McClane sets the film close to our reality, and keeps the action grounded. Not for forever, of course. In Live Free or Die Hard, the 4th film in the franchise, John McClane jumps onto a moving fighter jet. Well, of course, the Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II is an incredibly capable next-generation multi-role combat aircraft, and its part in this scene is perfectly believable. I find it a little harder to buy into John McClane's actions. No guy, everyday or not, can do that. In an instant, the film has moved from a believable amount of realism to an entirely separate reality. The stakes evaporate, the characters fall flat, and the logic of the world loses all meaning. The film has become terribly, irrevocably unrealistic. So it's easy for movies to be realistic, it's easy for them to be unrealistic, and we can probably conclude that Frodo Baggins has never tasted Mountain Dew. Big whoop. But I'm interested in the films that fall in that weird gray area in between these extremes. The films that feel like our reality, even as they extend far past it, that stretch and warp realism beyond the breaking point, and yet refuse to shatter it. The films that commit to their singular vision so deeply that it begins to feel more real than the chair you're sitting in. These films live in a heightened reality, recognizably our own, but fundamentally different. They insist that they are real so repeatedly, believe in their world so much that you have no choice but to agree, even as they push reality's boundaries further and further. By any definition, these films should be simply unrealistic, but there's something there I can't take my eyes off of, some core truth that pulls me back time and again, something real I can't deny. It would be very natural at this point for me to start talking about some obscure art film, something really interesting and underground that proves my point in a unique way. I'm not that cool. We're gonna talk about John Wick. John Wick is a series that eases you into its heightened reality. The beginning of the first film is John and his wife in some sort of terminal illness. a story that's all too real. It takes 20 minutes for us to literally uncover the actual story of the film. John digging up a briefcase of weaponry in his basement that will lead to the underground assassin ring, the gangs and gunfights and incredible violence that punctuate the rest of the series. This is not where the film becomes unrealistic. The characters in this assassin society ostensibly operate in a world underneath our own, a world that we plebeians have simply never noticed. That hotel you pass every day? Yes, it's a hotel, but people pay for rooms with gold drachmas and carry assault rifles instead of suitcases, but you, my friend, would never be allowed inside, so as far as you know, this is all true. Knowing that John Wick is an action movie gives the audience something to expect going in. They have a similarity class in mind as they sit down in the theater. There will be guns and blood, and the main character will probably bleed a little more than the human body should, but it's fine, who's counting? Oh, also the sets will probably be pretty realistic. There might be over-the-top set pieces, but the action will take place in parking garages and warehouses and those weird little alleyways that exist for people to beat each other up in. If there needs to be a wild set, the movie will go out of its way to justify it. These neon lights and techno music are because this is an underground club, of course. A real place that really exists. The first John Wick film is good about adhering to these standards. John bleeds, but not too much. The sets are cool, but justified. The movie is taking place just underneath the surface of our New York, our reality. It makes sense. The first John Wick film is not the movie I'm interested in. Here's the set from the final fight in John Wick Chapter 2. The sets of John Wick 2 blow the first movie out of the water. John has altercations in art museums, run-ins in Roman catacombs, confrontations at concerts. The movie frequently raises its settings up out of realism, adding neon lights in subway stations for the hell of it. The film, in some ways, is now taking place in a different reality. But it doesn't feel that way. Not only does John Wick 2 feel like a natural continuation of the first movie, but it still feels grounded and real in a way that's hard to explain. Of course, that's my job, so let's give it a shot. First of all, John Wick set out some very specific rules for its internal world. For films, even more important than how realistic they are according to our reality, is how realistic they are in their own reality. John McClane jumping on a fighter jet doesn't make sense in our world, and it doesn't make sense in his. The seams are showing. It's fake. But the world of John Wick stays internally coherent even as parts of it begin to ascend. This is very literal in the sense that the assassins have rules. No killing in those cool assassin hotels. Respect the blood packs, follow the high table. There are old debts and strange currencies and arms dealers that talk like they're discussing wine instead of machinery, but it all fits within this world's rules. Also, in a less literal sense, John Wick never jumps on a fighter jet. He fights more bad guys, kills them in more inventive ways, but never does something we don't believe his character could pull off. He is grounded in the logical rules this world has set out, the same physics and abilities and constraints as he had in the first film. Secondly, every bit of the movie that is heightened is in service to the action. The backgrounds are there to look stunning when they have blood sprayed across them. The new weapons are there to make the fights more interesting. The buildings are laid out to display the choreography of killing. John Wick knows that it is, first and foremost, a feast for the eyes, a parade of beautiful death, the aesthetic of the kill. The sets become an extension of the action, a backdrop equally as interesting as the foreground. The film's singular goal remains unchanged. But the sets complement the action in a deeper way too. As the stakes rise throughout the series, the sets rise with them. The neon lighting grows more intense as the trouble John's in grows deeper. By the fourth movie, even simple scenes of people talking are shot with stunning colors and contrast, John's emotions spilling out onto his surroundings, the plot too intense to be contained in simple dialogue, instead splattered across the world. These movies don't need to be subtle. In John Wick 4, it's nearly impossible to find a single normal set. Offices are cavernous and foreboding, or ostentatious to the point of hilarity. Fights are had not in warehouses, but in between starkly lit displays of weaponry and art, equating the two in shattered glass. The subway becomes a neon hellscape, red and blue all the way down. It means whatever you want it to mean. This train is grief or pain or violence. But what's important is that it's something more. It's a subway car, but it has been heightened, brought into a higher level of focus, something greater than normal. The pain of these characters would be out of place in a normal train car. Their blood would look strange next to rowdy teenagers and single moms and amateur graffiti. To make these sets realistic would be to highlight the film's ridiculousness. To make the characters feel like strangers in their own world, to contradict the single-minded focus of 4 films that has led us to a neon subway car in the first place. These ridiculous sets, this unreality, is the only way to make the movie feel real. At the end of the day, I believe in this neon subway far more than I believe in many more realistic films. It is a genuine expression of John Wick's world, of the emotions and violence and beauty it holds. This is a world unable to be contained in our reality alone, heightened almost to the point of ridiculousness, a hair's breadth away from shattering before our eyes. In its unrealism, John Wick achieves a near painful level of truth. The feelings of each character are immortalized, larger than life, in blood on shattered glass, in neon lighting, in the very world they live within. The John Wick film's connections to past stories gradually become more obvious. John's enemies meet in a nameless museum and then in the Louvre. Allusions to painters, sculptors, and Greek and Roman myths abound. Some references are easy to miss. Is John simply stabbing someone in the eye? Or is that a hint at Un Chien Andalou, the 1929 French silent film by Salvador Dali? I'm joking, of course, it's obviously a reference to Dead Space 2. John Wick extends its fiction beyond itself by referencing things outside of it, but it's a tame example of this. The references are secondary to the story occurring right now. But some movies don't stop at references. Some are built of the things that came before them. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is an adaptation of a graphic novel series. It's a comic book movie, but also a video game movie and a film movie. It's hard to know what to expect from Scott Pilgrim going in. Many fans blame the subpar trailer for the film flopping at the box office, but I wouldn't know how to make a better one. It's a rom-com and an action movie, but also not quite either. And it relies on a very specific series of events to get you to buy into its world. From the start, Scott Pilgrim doesn't hide its multimedia construction. The pixelated Universal logo fades directly into a narration lifted from the comic books. Within the first minute, onomatopoeia appears in bubble letters on the screen, and in the background you can hear video game sound effects.
She's Chinese.
Whoa, that's like Zelda! I know that game! But these tropes are mixed with the language of cinema. The little text box describing Scott gets out of focus as he walks toward the camera. The shots look like comic book panels, but also like normal shot-reverse-shot sequences. This film is playing with not only multiple genres, but the language of multiple mediums, merging the real and the virtual and the hand-drawn into one world. A world that appears to be, other than the references, relatively average. The film shatters this conception only 3 minutes in, the camera pulling back into Steven's living room, and back, and back, and back. The couch that was within reach a second ago has retreated impossibly far away, the very space of the world warping and twisting. By now, the rules of Scott Pilgrim's world have become clear. This film will do nothing to hide its artifice, will not bother to conceal and deny and cover up its unreality. It will display it proudly, in comic book speech bubbles and video game pixelation and spaces that can't exist. The film insists this is all part of the same world, beautiful in its impossibility. Here are the seams, it's saying. Aren't they cool? Even after the impossible long shot in the living room, Scott Pilgrim maintains some semblance of normalcy. You may think that perhaps the characters lead normal lives, simply filtered through a heightened lens, told through the language of three mediums at once. They go to arcades and record stores, they take the bus and fumble conversations at parties. I mean, the actual story of Scott Pilgrim is aggressively normal. A guy trying to get a girl. But there's always something lurking in the background. Ramona explains her presence in Scott's dreams as her using a subspace highway.
No, it's just you have this really convenient subspace highway running through your head that I like to use. It's like 3 miles in 15 seconds.
Right.
I forgot you guys don't have that in Canada.
This seems perfectly normal to her. Space breaks in other ways, the same door leading different places or appearing out of the dark. Wallace is so gossipy he somehow manages to spread news within 4 seconds of hearing it while being asleep. A breach of privacy that would frankly be worrying if it weren't so impressive. The dance moves Scott and Niamh pull off at the arcade are brushed over, but weirdly involved for a ninja-themed DDR ripoff. There's constantly the feeling that there is something under the surface of this world, some strangeness we simply haven't encountered in full yet. We accept each weird little moment, the story pulling us along too fast to really question them. It's just the language of video games and comics, a garnish on a realistic story. Or it's a metaphor, or hand-waving, or any other number of things, but nothing unbelievable is actually happening, right? It's just weird. 30 minutes in, the other shoe drops.
Mr. Pilgrim!
What do I do?
Fine!
Suddenly, the video game and comic book language of the film makes perfect sense. While the movie's genre is put into question, hard to define, impossible to predict the similarity class out of, the inspirations from these other mediums become more important than ever. This is a comic book movie with comic book logic. Of course the sound effects appear on screen and the characters' fists have motion lines flying off of them. This is a video game movie with video game logic. Of course Scott can build a combo, of course a pixelated versus flashes between them and the sound effects are all 8-bit. It turns out the genre of the film isn't what should be informing our idea of its similarity class, but instead the alternate mediums it's drawing from. The film has, in 30 seconds, upended its entire world in a way that doesn't feel unnatural. Its logic has shifted, but not been broken. The film now adhering to the rules of multiple mediums as if it's the most natural thing in the world. Like every strange happening in the film, you're carried through this scene before you have time to question it. The characters accepting it without comment.
Didn't you get my email explaining the situation?
I skimmed it.
This is a normal Toronto afternoon to them. The logic of Scott Pilgrim's reality is expanded, and at the same time you realize it has always been like this. This is how this world works. Scott Pilgrim's reality is constructed of the fictions outside itself. It relies on the audience understanding the logic systems of these other worlds and accepting that they also apply here. The film is a riot of reference, a celebration of everything that's come before it. Things as close as the comic books, and now the animated show, mingle with Pac-Man and Ninja Gaiden. One-ups and stat buffs mixed with comic book layouts and continuities, the logic of multiple mediums blending and clashing. And through the references, the audience begins to participate in the film's world building. As they recognize things, they engage on a deeper level, pulling on their own knowledge and constructing their own unique version of the Scott Pilgrim world, the Scott Pilgrim logic, buying into it further and further as the film only becomes more wild. If you've accepted that first fight scene, the rest of the film will make perfect sense. Vegans have superpowers that can be taken away by the vegan police? Alright.
You once were a vegan, but now you will be gone.
Vegan.
Bands can summon dragons and yetis to fight over the crowd? Checks out.
What are you doing?
Getting a life.
Scott pulls a sword out of his chest and turns a group of bad guys into piles of coins by slicing them in half? Awesome! It's video game logic, or comic book logic, or Scott Pilgrim logic. It doesn't really matter. You have already accepted that this world is made of ridiculous things, that it is furiously, hyperactively unreal. It has no need to explain itself. Either you get it, or you don't. Over the course of the film, the story of Scott Pilgrim is heightened and heightened and heightened again. The core emotional truths of the narrative spread outward across space and time and medium. This is a story bursting with very real feelings and very real characters and very real passion, so much so that it can't be contained within our reality or even within one film. Beyond the references to other pieces of media, there are the Scott Pilgrim comic books, and the Scott Pilgrim TV show, and the Scott Pilgrim video game, each of which takes advantage of its medium to spin a unique narrative within this world. The story of Scott Pilgrim is simple and real, but brought to dizzying heights by its multimediality, by its constant references, by its ridiculous commitment to unrealism. It could not exist in our reality. Instead, it must spread to encompass everything, so over the top it's impossible to ignore, grounded only by its constant tethers to everything around it. Isn't that cool? Scott Pilgrim is in love with what came before it. The film Pacific Rim feels the same way. It's an homage to every kaiju and mecha movie ever made, the epitome of the genre. Exactly what you'd expect from a generic action director making a big robot monster punch-out movie. Guillermo del Toro made this film? Films that adhere closely to their chosen genre, also known as genre films, don't stray too far outside the boundaries set by other movies. They are, in some sense, an average of every movie before them. They're not what we expect from a director like Guillermo del Toro. We expect him to take these trite and overdone stories and turn them into something wholly new, something subversive and unexpected. Pacific Rim is not that film. What it is the most epic movie ever made. A critic reviewing Pacific Rim wrote that if you came looking for a big-budget kaiju movie with giant robots smacking enormous sea creatures up and down Hong Kong with scant regard for property damage, Pacific Rim is going to blow your socks off. And your feet. In fact, you'll be lucky to have anything left below the knee. Pacific Rim has a singular vision, and delivers on it with every second of its runtime. There's no easing you into this world. From the first minute, there are big, scary monsters, but these are no house-sized terrors. They are skyscraper-sized behemoths, dwarfing the humans running underfoot, endless teeth and tails and talons bleeding bright blue. They come not from outer space or the depths of the ocean, but both at once, crawling through an interdimensional rift at the bottom of the Pacific. The mechs are similarly enormous, equipped with chest missiles or 3 arms or rocket-powered punches or swords as long as an aircraft carrier. They're controlled by people, but not just one, don't be ridiculous. It takes 2 or even 3 people in full-body suits to shoulder the burden of these mechs, their limbs mechanically linked with each other and the robot, in perfect sync with each, their very minds melded through a process known as drift compatibility. The fights take place in neon-soaked cities, in oceans, in torrential downpours, the lighting always overdramatic, throwing the kaiju and mechs into sharp relief. The film is so committed to its color scheme of blue and orange that you'd be hard-pressed to find a single scene that wasn't soaked in those two colors. Everything from crumbling ocean-sized walls to the depths of the Resistance compound to the inside of the mechs they pilot is blue and orange, orange and blue. In this world, there are always sun-bright sparks going off somewhere in the background. Pacific Rim is larger than life in so many ways it's impossible to list them all. Heck, the rallying speech before the final confrontation ends with Idris Elba yelling, "We are canceling the apocalypse!" It doesn't get much more overdramatic than that. The story matches the over-the-top visuals, each fight spelling doom for the entire human race if it fails, the characters battling impossible odds that only get more impossible over time. But within the explosions and kaiju battles and city destruction, is a painfully human story. A struggle to connect with others after trauma, a struggle to be trusted with responsibility, a struggle to ever own shoes that are half this cool. Okay, joking about that last one, but my point stands. Threaded through and between every jaw-dropping set piece are human stories, raised to the level of giants. Everything in this movie matters so much. Each emotion could make or break their drift compatibility, each conversation could alter history, each deployment could be their last. This movie cares almost to the point of cringe. It spills out of the text into the world, every shot heightened and overdramatic just to try and match the energy of the story. Like in John Wick, these characters would be out of place in our reality, under normal lighting, in normal-sized spaces. Every truth is too large, too important, and too much to exist in our world. It must be translated into building-sized mechs and continent-sized stakes, into improbably harsh lines of blue and orange. It is wild and over the top, and deeply, deeply human. Most critics didn't really know what to make of Pacific Rim. They panned it for being unoriginal and mainstream. One critic said it was an example of how even smart, idiosyncratic directors can make dumb, impersonal movies. Rude much? This book, an entire book of essays about Guillermo del Toro's work, released a year after Pacific Rim came out, includes many essays that ignore the film entirely, actively choosing not to engage with it. But there is one essay specifically about Pacific Rim. In it, Niamh Thornton argues that Pacific Rim is an example of geek auteurship, a film which celebrates generic conventions and is chock full of references, but still contains auteurist touches, slight flourishes that elevate the movie above the generic. Pacific Rim's multiculturalism, the way it depicts cooperation on a global scale, its refusal of pro-military tropes, and its constant commitment to empathy are all examples of Del Toro's handiwork. He shifts the tropes of the genre without altering them completely, encouraging recognition of the film's many references in a way similar to Scott Pilgrim. The audience gets to play along in the construction of the world. This film is like Gojira, this film is like Evangelion, but at the same time, this film is something entirely new, drawing on these inspirations without adhering to them. Even the story itself feels steeped in the past, starting 7 years after the first kaiju attack. The world is populated with a mixture of new and old technology, two-way radios next to holographic screens. Everything from the tech to the people to the cities is battered and bruised and used. This is a film that is looking back as it looks forward, drawing from tropes as much as it's playing with them, creating something recognizable but wholly new, reimagining without being radical. So why does Pacific Rim, this ridiculously over-the-top movie, feel real to me? Part of it is the same idea as John Wick, the deeply human truths at the heart of the story spilling out into the world, the heights of emotion unable to be contained in our reality alone, creating something that feels realer than real. Part of it is like Scott Pilgrim, the constant references and allusions, the love of everything outside of itself, expanding its world to encompass what came before it, making itself more real through its knowledge of the other. And part of it is that Pacific Rim is the most single-minded movie I have ever watched. Every shot overdramatic, every line earth-shaking, everything in service of its aesthetic. This movie has no concept of cringe, no concept of fake. It only knows how to commit 110% all of the time. Everything about Pacific Rim is genuine. You can tell just watching it that so much love and care was poured into this film. Despite all the auteur films he made before it, Del Toro says of Pacific Rim that rarely has a movie been more important for him personally, and that it was the only shoot he's ever enjoyed. This movie was made by passionate people, actors and directors and writers that really truly cared how it turned out. Maybe Pacific Rim is 110% all the time simply because that's the level of effort that people put into it, shining through in every scene. The film feels genuine from top to bottom because that's how it was made, with real, unmistakable passion. No amount of CGI kaiju battles could hide that. In fact, even though the kaiju were obviously CGI, far more of this movie was done practically, done for real, than you may think. In an interview with the costume designer, she said delightedly that Pacific Rim was the messiest, dirtiest movie she's ever worked on. The stunt coordinator said that every set was huge, everything was a massive spectacle. You were in awe every single day. Those mech control pods? Those were real! The actors were actually inside that full-body armor, actually attached to the machinery, being puppeted by people on the outside. How cool is that? Unfortunately, they didn't actually build the mechs attached to the control seats, but believe me, as soon as those are real, I'm going to be the first in line. This level of effort and passion on the shoot translates into a movie that feels real, no matter how unrealistic the actual story becomes. There is a truth at the center of Pacific Rim, a passion you can't ignore. This is true for John Wick and Scott Pilgrim too. The cast of Scott Pilgrim clearly had a ton of fun filming the movie, laughing with each other in each blooper take, riffing on each other's lines, and joking behind the scenes. These people are all excellent actors on their own, but the chemistry they bring to the set is electric. The mischief in their eyes clear even in the takes that made it into the film. This is a group of people having fun, pouring their heart and soul into a ridiculous project simply because they believe in it. Nobody half-assing something agrees not to blink for a whole scene just to copy the aesthetic of a comic book. The shoot was so much fun that 9 years after the film's release, Michael Cera revived the cast's old email thread with a single offhanded reply to something. That is so unfair. Most of my group chats die after the 4th time I make them watch Pacific Rim with me. And yet, when Edgar Wright, the director of Scott Pilgrim, reached out later over the same email thread to ask the cast to be in the Netflix show, within 3 hours, everyone was in. Unbelievable. There was a level of camaraderie and enthusiasm on the set of Scott Pilgrim that ends up shining through in every scene of the movie. Real friendships and passion behind every ridiculous shot. The John Wick films are also surprisingly real behind the camera. They're famous for having Keanu do all his own fights, from the comparatively simple gunfight at the start of the series to the breathtaking minute and 45-second single-shot fight in the 4th movie. The director, Chad Stahelski, is a stunt performer himself, always pushing the actors to do more, to go above and beyond with the spectacle they're creating. Watching John Wick has the same joy as watching a beautifully choreographed musical, seeing people do something nearly unbelievable with their bodies and knowing it's real. The awe these movies create is based on the genuine work people are doing behind the scenes. The long, steady shots hide none of the action as every performer is pushed to their limit, Every punch and kick and tumble as real as it gets. This is a level of effort that's frankly unnecessary. Things that could be done just as easily with CGI or shaky cam or a liberal application of stunt actors. But this dedication to the craft makes the movies feel that much more real. The sets are ridiculous, the lighting unbelievable, but these people, their bodies, their passion is actually there. The people making these movies know they are creating not just a movie, but a spectacle. Something ridiculous and beautiful, but at the same time, genuine. They want you to love this film as much as they loved making it. Yes, it's easy for movies to be realistic, but that ignores the camera we never see, the script we never read, the late nights and stage fights and bright lights we are supposed to forget about, every part of the artifice that must be removed for a film to seem real. Movies are always, somehow, unrealistic. It's just that these films don't care about hiding that. The real people, the real time, the real passion that went into these movies is on full display, obviously in blooper reels and behind-the-scenes footage, or more subtly, in that feeling you get when you watch a scene and you can tell the actors were having fun. When you see something awesome and epic and realize someone sat in post-production and said, yes, that is so cool. We have to include that. These over-the-top films feel real for a lot of reasons. Maybe it's your genre expectations going in, or the emotions splattered across the screen in so much neon lighting. Maybe it's the way they connect themselves to everything that came before them, or the single-minded commitment they have to their premise. Somehow, even in the middle of sky-shaking kaiju battles, these films find a way to ground themselves, a way to connect to a deeply human story, a way to feel real. And even as their heightened realities transcend the everyday, they are always gesturing outside themselves at the very normal editors and directors and actors that poured their souls into every frame. Look at the explosions and the fights and the lighting, these movies are saying. And then look beyond them and see everyone that cared. Isn't that cool?